Hey everyone, welcome to Tim's Vinyl Confessions. I'm Tim Durling. Thanks for watching once again. I really appreciate all of your support for the channel, support for the book. Supporting the book supports my channel. It's all kind of the same thing. So thank you for tuning in for this one. This is an episode, an idea I've had for a little while, and it's something that almost as long as I've been buying music and really paying attention to things like record labels, that I've noticed. And it's nothing new because it's been going on for years, as you'll see, but I call it the former label's response. So this is when an artist or a group records for a particular record label, and then either their contract runs out or there's a breach in the contract or whatever it is, they switch to another label. Now, whether they're successful on the new label or not, almost without fail, the former label will then try and capitalize on any possible success that an artist might have after they've left the label. It happens all the time. It continues to happen. Sometimes the record label makes it clear that what they're putting out is not new material, the former label that is. Sometimes it's kind of ambiguous, as you'll see here. And sometimes it happens over and over again with the same artist and the same pair of labels. So I've got 10 examples here of what I'm calling the former label's response. So I think this is going to be a fun episode. Of course, we're going to talk about some great music too, but it'll make people notice that, you know, all of a sudden you see a best of or some sort of compilation come out. It's never, oh, we need to put this out just because. It's always, there's a strategic reason for these things coming out. And sometimes it's almost immediate. We'll get to that. So I want to go back to the earliest example that I can think of. Goes back to 1972, and the band is Deep Purple. So Deep Purple, the first three Deep Purple albums were on various labels throughout the world. They were on Tetragrammaton, they were on Polydor, they were on GRT, you know, and they've been issued so many times. But obviously, Deep Purple's real success began when they, you know, the Mark II lineup solidified, and they were on EMI in a lot of places in the world, and other places in the world, including North America. They were on Warner Brothers. So this is the biggest Deep Purple album, Machine Head, and came out in 1972. Of course, this is, you know, it's got Smoke on the Water, it's got Highway Star, Lazy, Space Truckin', you know, this is the big one, right? So this comes out, you know, big album, on the charts for like a solid year, and you know, the band is at this point one of the biggest bands in the world. And so the former material, or the first three albums, or the material from it, they've been issued so many times, like so many times. But I want to show you the very first of these compilations that I ever saw, and this also came out in 1972. This foreboding little thing here is called the Best of Deep Purple. Now, it's the best of Mark I. Is it the best from Mark I? That's debatable. Now, you might look at this and think, oh, Best of Deep Purple. This must have Black Knight and Fireball and Strange Kind of Woman and Smoke on the Water. No. As far as hits, well, yes, it's got Hush and it's got Kentucky Woman. This is all Mark I stuff with this really odd back cover. I mean, you know, Rod Evans full on the empire here. But anyway, this came out in Canada on Polydor, who distributed those albums at the time. So this came out the same year Machine Head did. And I have to think that there's a reason for that. But what's really odd about that, and this kind of, I also dug this out, kind of further illustrate the Wild West nature of the rights to those first three Deep Purple albums, or the material on it. Warner Brothers also put this out in 1972, which is called Purple Passages, and it's a double album of songs from the Mark I lineup. So I have to wonder if this is in response to that Polydor release, which I don't think came out in the States. Very confusing, but there's a lot of that, you know, and obviously there's a lot more examples of that in the Deep Purple catalog, but that's the first example, and that's what I'm talking about with the former label kind of sticking their head out of the sand and saying, hey, you know, we got some stuff from this group too. Next up, subject of one of my books, one of my favorite rock and rollers ever, Sammy Hagar, plied his trade to little results on Capitol Records from 1976 through 1980. Put out 5 studio albums. None of them were really that successful. None of them certified, and he was just constantly putting out new albums, hitting the road, and to really minimal success. And as we know, 1981, he becomes one of David Geffen's first signings to Geffen Records. So even though it's dated 1981, it didn't come out till very early 1982. Sammy puts out the Standing Hampton record that says I'll Fall in Love Again. It's got There's Only One Way to Rock. It's got heavy metal. This was his first big album. It went gold within the year and eventually certified platinum. So finally, he had a successful album after all this time. So this was actually his 6th studio album, and he finally was, on the path to some success. 1982 also saw the release of this. So this is Rematch. This comes out through Capitol Records, Sammy's former label. Now, Capitol Records would do this a lot. I talk a lot about in my Red on Black book about truck stop tapes. This isn't a truck stop tape. This was disguised, I'm going to say, as a legitimate release. And even though it's called Rematch, so this is a 10-song best of from Sammy's Capitol career. Are they the 10 songs I would have picked? No. A lot of them are. And it's got Trans Am, and it's got the songs that you would kind of expect. There were no real hits. But it doesn't really make it plain that this is previously released material. So this one is a kind of a deceptive one. So all those unwary fans that might have bought Standing Hampton might have thought Sammy had a brand new album out. Because it's not called Greatest Hits, because he didn't have any. It's not called Best Of. It's not called Anthology or the Sammy Hagar compilation. It's called Rematch. So a little tricky on that one. And this would happen a lot with Capitol in response to Geffen. The next one is one of my favorites because it's so back and forth. I'm only going to talk about the first example, but happened a lot with this band. By the mid-1980s, Aerosmith were pretty much on the rocks, and most critics had written them off, said they were washed up, they were drugged out, their best days were behind them. Well, we all know that's not true, but it did get off to a shaky start. So after releasing all of their albums on Columbia Records from the debut through Rock and a Hard Place, they get a deal with Geffen Records. Again, John Kolodner from Geffen Records comes in, saves the day. But it did get off to a rocky start. I think quite a good album, done with mirrors. So this came out in late 1985. This wasn't a big success. It went gold eventually. But there was always that chance that Aerosmith might do well on a new label. So their former label, Columbia, or more specifically, I want to say their former managers, David Krebs and Steve Lieber, had the rights to all of Aerosmith's masters from the Columbia years. And my buddy Martin Popoff can correct me on this, but I think they still do. I don't know if the band ever got them back or not. Maybe they did. I'm not sure about that, but they definitely did in the 80s. So this was the first of many times when Aerosmith put something out on Geffen, and then Columbia, CBS, later Sony, responded. And so sometime in 1986, this came out, Aerosmith Classics Live. It's just a compilation of songs from, this one ranges from 77 through 83. So there is some Jimmy Crespo, Rick Dufay stuff on here, which I actually think is kind of cool. The stuff from Night in the Ruts on here. Now, I don't know if this came out in 86 after Run DMC's successful remake of Walk This Way with Stephen and Joe. That would have really made a lot more sense. But where I'm going is that they followed it up in 87 with another batch of live songs called Classics Live 2. Looked just like that with a red cover. Eventually, they put it out as a single CD because they're pretty short records. As we know, Aerosmith put out Permanent Vacation in 1987. Huge album. They're on their way back. 1988, Columbia releases Gems. A great compilation, but totally in response. And because it's called Gems, again, doesn't really sound like it's a best of, they put Chip Away the Stone out as a single. It didn't really do much, but, it was trying. Then Pump comes out in 1989 on Geffen and does even better than Permanent Vacation. What's the next thing to come out? Columbia releases Pandora's Box, the box set. And it goes on and on like this, like Geffen puts something out, Columbia puts something out, and vice versa. So when Aerosmith re-signed with Columbia Records and put out 9 Lives, the very next year, Geffen puts out A Little South of Sanity, a live album. So with Aerosmith, it goes back and forth. And now I guess all of their stuff is on Universal, so we'll see what happens with that. But yeah, that was a prime example. And one of the first times I really noticed, because I used to list everything, I used to keep, very detailed, meticulous notes of whenever I bought anything, and then I'd put them in order of, chronological order or whatever. And it would go Geffen, Columbia, Geffen, Columbia. So that's when I really noticed that, that labels did this. Totally makes sense. Totally makes sense. Next up, I want to switch over to another artist. Excuse me, 1989. A big comeback album for Alice Cooper, Trash. This is on Epic CBS. This is actually a box design label. This is Alice's biggest album in 13 years. It's a platinum record. He has a top 10 single with Poison. He was practically, nobody my age really knew who Alice Cooper was until this came out. He had the 2 MCA albums in 86 and 87. He was doing okay on the road, but those weren't big pop success albums. This was a breakthrough album that all of a sudden, I remember Alice, a lot of people went to this show. I didn't, but when I was in grade 10, so this would have been early 1990, Alice played Fredericton, which is about an hour away from me, Great Wide Open, and a lot of people went to that show. So I saw a lot of shirts with this on it the next day. But this came out, I want to say this came out midsummer 1989. By the fall of 1989, MCA pops this out. It's called Prince of Darkness, and this is just a single disc compilation of songs from Constrictor and Raise Your Fist and Yell. It's also got, it's kind of bizarre, it's got a live version of $1 Billion Babies that's listed as from 1976, but it's not. Now, my buddy Mike Meadus, the Alice Cooper collector, would know this for sure, but I think it's actually from that really strange Alice in Paris special that came out in 1982 in France. So I don't know where they got the rights to any of that, and why they picked just the one song. I don't know. But my point is that in order for this to come out in the fall of 89, I have to think that as soon as it was known in the industry that Alice was switching labels from MCA to Epic, they were already working on this. And as it turns out, yes, it was a successful album, Trash, that is. This came out, just shortly afterwards, and it didn't, it didn't bring this up with it. But also in 1989, I actually don't have this, but his original label, Warner Brothers, where he had the bulk of his success, put a best of out in Europe and other parts of the world called The Beast of Alice Cooper. And I think all that is his old 1974 greatest hits with 3 songs from Welcome to My Nightmare. But that also came out in response to the success of Trash. Another example of 2 releases coming out very close to one another. I'm going to talk about this band. Conflicting reports on when this album actually came out. I think it came out around May of 1990 because I don't remember seeing it before then. Y&T 10, my entry point into the band and still my favorite album by them. So this was their second album on Geffen. And I didn't see it until September, but it might have come out sooner. But by summer of 1990, their former label, A&M, pops this out. Best of 81 to 85. So they were obviously thinking maybe 10 might do it for them. Now, I love this compilation. I love the artwork. And it was the first time I got to hear a lot of the older Y&T material. My point is, though, they were obviously working on this when when they knew the Geffen album was coming out. It's actually not the first time they did that, but it's the first worldwide time they did that, because A&M Japan, when Y&T put Contagious out, which was their first Geffen album, A&M put out a compilation called Forever, the best of Y&T, but that only came out in Japan. Next up, we have a band that made a lot of money for Atlantic Records, and they were on that label from 1969 all the way through 1987, and that band is Yes. So as the story goes, 1989, the Anderson, Bruford, Wakeman Howe album comes out on Arista Records. That album does decently. It actually goes gold. And what started as the second album on that Arista contract ended up being a blended Yes album and quite a confusing mess of an album too, I might add, called Union. Now this came out in early 1991. Great Roger Dean artwork. Martin Popoff and I talked about this on The Contrarians. This is kind of a mess of an album. But my point is, this album came out on Arista. It went gold. The song Lift Me Up was a #1 mainstream rock hit. So, combination of the fact that, 1990, 91 was the era where box sets were becoming really popular, but I have to think it was also because, yes, it switched labels. Atlantic Records puts this out. This is called Yes Years, and this is a 4 CD or 4 cassette box set of Yes material from Atlantic Records. This is the CD version. The cassette version is in the same size box. And they put out a song as a single from this to make it even more confusing called Make It Easy, which was recorded for the 90125 sessions. So yeah, there's that's Atlantic responding to them being on Arista, even though their time on Arista was short. You just never know, right? Hey, what if it's a hit? And they doubled down on this because the very next year, in 92, they put a 2 CD version out of this called Yes Story. And then in 1993, they put out a single disc version called Highlights, the Very Best of Yes. So, and, record labels would do that a lot. Rhino would do that a lot. They'd put out a box set, then they'd put out a condensed version of it. Next one's one of my favorite artists that I love talking about because he's kind of an unsung artist. Hope he's doing well. He had a fall earlier this year. Aldo Nova. So Aldo's first album came out on CBS, Portrait CBS, in 82. Was a double platinum album. Fantasy was, of course, his signature song. Second album, Subject, came out in 83. It eventually went gold. Twitch came out in 85, was not successful. He did those 3 records, and then he kind of went under the radar for 6 years. He worked in commercials. He worked in songwriting. In 1991, he reemerges that summer with this album, Blood on the Bricks. Love this album. I was so into this album when it came out. I think it came out about 2 or 3 years too late because it should have been a hit. There's a lot of songs in here that could have been big, big songs for him. Of course, he worked on this with John Bon Jovi, co-wrote most of the album, co-produced it. So this came out on John's label Jamco, which was distributed by Mercury Records, right? I always like the looks of this CD too. But anyway, my point is, so this came out, I'm gonna say June 1991 maybe. By August, this appeared in stores. Now this is called A Portrait of Aldo Nova, which is a pun on Portrait Records, which at this point was not an active label. It was switched over to the Epic label. But Sony Music was putting out a lot of compilations under their Legacy banner. So a lot of them came out in 1991. But for this to come out, this is just songs from Aldo's first 3 albums, but for this to come out when it did, this was obviously also being worked on probably before Blood on the Bricks ever came out, so they had something to zip into the stores and be placed side by side with Blood on the Bricks. I mean, it makes financial sense, right? Now, unfortunately, Blood on the Bricks did not hit, so subsequently this didn't either, but they probably figured they didn't want to get caught with egg on their faces and have to scramble to put something out, even though this is kind of scrambled, if you ask me. Because mostly it's his first album. And at the time, that was the easiest one to get, but I digress. Now, the next one I want to talk about is an ongoing story of a band and their former singer, and I'm talking about Journey. So as we know, Steve Perry leaves Journey, 1987, comes back for one album, Trial by Fire, in 1996. Eventually, he leaves for good. But the terms of his leaving were very complicated in order for Journey to continue with a new singer, as it turns out, new singers. So there's one example I'm going to pinpoint, but the first example that I can think of is where whenever Journey would do something, Steve Perry and or Columbia would do something in response. So in 1998, Journey gets Steve Augeri to sing. The very first single with Steve Augeri on vocals is Remember Me, great song, on the Armageddon soundtrack, which is a big soundtrack, okay? So that comes out on Sony, right? But that same year, Steve Perry releases his greatest hits. Now, he only had a handful, but there it comes out, right? That's the first example. 2001, 2000 in some territories, but in North America it was 2001, Arrival comes out, which is the first full-length album with Steve O'Gerry. Later that year, Sony, under the auspices of Steve Perry having some executive producer credit and probably compiled the thing, The Essential Journey comes out. Now, yes, Sony were doing a lot of these essential best ofs. It's just interesting that it came out the same year that Arrival did. Now the example I'm going to show you is that, of course, that was the last Journey album on Sony. So in 2005, this album comes out, Generations. I'm not going to talk about how good or bad the album is. This came out 2005 on Sanctuary. So Sanctuary was a sort of, it spun off from CMC International, but it had a little bit more distributing clout. In the US, it was distributed by Sony. In Canada, it was distributed by EMI. Either way, they had major label distributions. This comes out, I think, in summer or fall of 2005. Very soon after that, this appears in stores. And this is Live in Houston, 1981, from the Escape Tour. Produced by Steve Perry. So this was in response. This was directly in response. You can't tell me that it's not. And it didn't end there. In 2011, 2008, of course, Journey gets Arnel Pineda. They're on their way back to some success with the Revelation album. They put that out independently themselves, mostly via Walmart, and it did very well for them. It was a platinum album. Sony reissues the Greatest Hits, which has never gone out of print, but there was a sticker on it saying, these are the original versions of the songs, or something to that effect. And then 2011, they put out their second album with Arnel, Eclipse, again, independently. Some territories it was on Frontiers. And then Journey, Steve Perry, Sony releases Greatest Hits Volume 2. So there's always been, and there probably will always be, that sort of, or maybe now that records aren't selling, but that happened a lot in the Journey camp. So yeah, really kind of, anyway, gives us more to buy. I've got a couple more examples, really two that are kind of less volatile, I think. Queensryche. So Queensryche, very successful career on EMI, starting in 83 with their EP, and went all the way to 97 with Here and the Now Frontier. In 1999, this album comes out, Q2K, which was their first album that wasn't on EMI. In the US, it was on Atlantic Records. I've got the Canadian version here, which is actually on Anthem Records. But bottom line, it wasn't on EMI. So this comes out 1999. Very next year, EMI puts this out, Queensryche Greatest Hits. So, you know, it's another, I think, good example of that. And the final one is kind of, I'm a little surprised that it took the labels this long to start doing this. But Heart, of course, started on Mushroom Records, then they went over to Portrait CBS, and they were on CBS from 77 through 83. Started out successful, got less and less successful. By the time they got to 83's Passion Works, a great album, but it didn't chart. And as we know, they switched to Capitol Records, and they have their big comeback. So they have three big albums, the self-titled Bad Animals Brigade, big hit singles, most of them written by outside writers, but bottom line is they were selling records again. I'm really surprised that Sony didn't immediately respond with best ofs. I'm kind of really surprised by that, because look how quick CBS responded with Aerosmith. Again, I think that was mostly management. But I do want to show you a couple funny examples of this. In 1997, this comes out on Capitol Records. Now, this is called Heart. It says Heart Greatest Hits. Now, it's one of those awkward subtitles one. It's actually called These Dreams / Heart's Greatest Hits. So this, you know, the Mushroom material, so that means stuff from Dreamboat Annie and also Magazine. Every label seems to be able to license that. So you get the studio versions of Crazy on You and Magic Man and Heartless and that. So what this has when it comes to the Sony material is stuff that's either on the live album Rock the House Live. So that's where you get like Barracuda, and then stuff like Dog and Butterfly comes from the Road Home, their acoustic album, essentially their unplugged album, all of which they could get because it's in the Capitol Archive. So this comes out in 1997. The very next year, Sony releases this, it's just called Greatest Hits. And of course, this only goes to 1983. It doesn't have any of the Capitol stuff. And look how similar, really, look how similar these are. They have like a figure on them with a heart, and very confusing, you know. To me, this is the superior one. Now, somehow they worked out a deal, because in 2002, their Essential 2 CD Best Of comes out, and it combines these eras. That's the one to get. But this was 1 year after the other. So it's happened before, it'll happen again, and it's just the way of the music business. So those are 10 examples of the former label's response. Have you got any out there? I know you must. Let's hear about them. Let me know in the comments. And I want to thank everybody for watching this edition of Tim's Vinyl Confessions. If you haven't already, please hit subscribe. It doesn't cost you anything to subscribe. Just makes a difference in the algorithms and all that funky stuff, all right? Thanks everybody for watching. We'll see you later.